mention them, but we'll discuss them more on Thursday, along with another chapter from a book that looks at women's, young girls' education in Jordan, sort of development discourse, development, modernization, language. Okay. I don't need to lock you out. It's just the doors. Okay, so let's start with that. So, over the course of the semester, we've used the term modernization, modernizing, quite a few times. And it means a whole series of different things, referring to different periods of time as well. Sometimes it's about particular processes. Sometimes it's pertaining to a period of time. So it's a vague category, right, that people sort of use and throw out. And we'll talk about what it means to you. Well, let me just start with that. What are some things that you associate with the idea of modernization? Let's just start with that list, and then we'll go from there. What do you think? When someone says modernization, what do they mean? Okay. So, technology. And what constitutes technology? So, just like plumbing, electricity. So, basic infrastructure, right? That kind of thing, like asphalt roads, plumbing, electricity. Okay, what else? But not like, so for example, you know, a wheel, right? The invention of a wheel, the wheel, was a major change in human history, right? That transformed mobility. That would be a technology, but that's not what you're talking about, right? Because we're talking, that's an ancient technology, right? So the question is, what constitutes technology, right? Well, what?
Everyone can have a wheel.
Everyone can have a wheel, right? But when the wheel was invented, right? Like that transformed human history because that made movement completely different than it had been before. But that's not the kind of technology that you're thinking of. Like you're thinking of something like plumbing, electricity, asphalt roads, that kind of technology. Okay. What do you think of when you think of modernization? New. Okay.
So it's not really modern. The word is just not it doesn't really narrow down for me. It just stays very broad.
So every new thing becomes modern, right? So, you know, something in the 18th century that was new would be modern. Something in the 15th century that was new would be modern. So anything that's new is just another way of saying new. But do you think of the 15th century as modern? No. But it was modern at the time. That's what you're saying. You're going to add.
I think that the whole concept of like modern is very Eurocentric because it's always based on whatever's new and modern and like technologically up to date in Europe, never anywhere else.
Right. So it's based on what is new in Europe, that is constituted as modern. And then everything else is sort of playing catch up to that. But if something is new first elsewhere, that wouldn't necessarily be called modern. Is what they're saying. So it becomes modern when it's associated with Europe. Huh? Industry. And what? Population growth.
Like medium-ish and agriculture.
So like industrial agriculture. So agriculture, but as industry. Is that what you mean when you're talking about new methods in agriculture? What are you thinking? the use of fertilizer, irrigation, like mechanical agriculture, is that what you mean? So, but agriculture as sort of, I think you mean like mechanized agriculture, right? So industrial agriculture, basically, like, when agriculture is mechanized.
Innovation in human rights or revolution in a society, for example, the slaves used to be there, now it abolished, or the women rights of voting. So these were considered as modern in modern day.
Okay, so you're talking about sort of social, right? The idea of equality, right?
Yeah.
Right. Basically, you're talking about what's called liberalism, right? Not liberal in the not an American idea of liberalism, but you're talking about liberalism in sort of in a philosophical, political sense, sort of coming out of back to the Eurocentric model, out of the French Revolution, right? The idea of equality as the human base. Absolutely.
I was actually seeing it on the other side of that, where it's a widening class divide, and like modernization is usually benefiting one group, with that group saying you're doing it wrong, so let us take over. So it splits the gap in economic growth much wider, creating inequality.
And so where would that be coming from? Where is this class splitting? What in modernization is making that split?
Those who feel it would come from the state. The state would be the modernizers, and so those who were embracing or pushing for the modernization are the ones that are deciding what new methods we'll use and passing those down to the people who will be passing money back up to them at a later date.
So you're talking about a kind of idea of the relationship between the political system, right, political power, and class structure, right? So the idea that class hierarchies are reproduced in a political system. So tax benefits going to the wealthy who are influencing the laws that create the tax benefits.
Yeah, and the people who have enough money to modernize are the ones that end up benefiting from the modernization, while, at what the article pointed out, the sharecroppers who can fall by the wayside and pay towards the landholders.
Exactly. So, I don't want to completely just to over-determine this idea, but people have associated that with capitalism, right? That capitalism is the reproduction of these class hierarchies that are related to a political system that reproduces in the interests of people. So, yes.
Probably fall in technology, but it's also
What were you saying?
Probably fall in technology. The one I'm going to say is innovation in medical science. For example, previously diseases like cholera and other diseases, smallpox or yellow fever cannot be cured, but modern day it cannot be cured. Even in the village areas.
Called science.
Yeah.
Right? So this idea of science.
Even in some villages today, they don't have these technologies of curing people of these diseases, because this technology the modernization didn't went to those villages.
Okay. Yeah. So I would put that under something called science. So whether it's medical science or whether it's physics or whatever different sort of notions of something called science that either has to do with the human body or with the world around us, and that might be associated with modernization. So let's think a little bit about. So these are all, excellent, and they point to both sort of material changes in human condition and human life, as well as social forms, social ideas, like ideas about social relations, right? Material conditions and social relations, both the ideas about them and as a manifestation of social relations. So those two parts of it. And if we think about, over the course of the semester, we've talked about, one period, sort of temporal period more, but then sort of alluded to a second one that's associated with a kind of modernization. The first one is in this period in the sort of mid-late 19th century, right, in the Middle East, where you had these, Gelbin called, defensive developmentalism, right? And that's what he's talking about here, where what he's sort of talking about is transformations in society that are both material transformations, as well as ideas about governing and ruling and social relations, which both changes in governing and rule and relationships of subjects or citizens to the state, and the material conditions in which people live. And he's primarily interested in that 19th century period, right, where there are attempts to transform society on both fronts. And you can sort of see all of this in that period, right? And historians have associated the 19th century in the Middle East with all of these things, right? And we can talk about them in the late 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, but you can also understand how these are 19th century transformations as well. And so we've talked about, earlier in the semester we talked about these, both the material conditions and then the social governing conditions, right? Or ideas about them on both sides. So again, 19th century, we talked about that quite a bit with Muhammad Ali. We talked about the Qajars, right? We talked about the Ottomans in Constantinople, not just Muhammad Ali in Egypt, right? So all of these are trying to introduce all of these, changing both the material conditions as well as the system of governing and the social relations of people in those systems of government. Okay. Now, we've alluded to, but not talked about quite so much, another period of this kind of transformation, interest in transformation, actually in two forms. One was we talked about in the 1920s, which is another feature, 1920s, 1930s, with Reza Shah Pahlavi in Iran and Atatürk in Turkey, right? Here we see another sort of major push to do all of this. Right? A third period that we talked about sort of in passing, but not gone into so much depth, but although we did a little bit with Iran, was in the, well, Iran didn't have this particular experience, but in the 50s and 60s, in the kind of post-colonial moment, right? So in the post-colonial, in the post-mandate period, right? Mandates start to be untangled, and we have the establishment of these actually independent states, right? Or you have revolutions like in Iraq, where the monarchy that is supposedly independent, right, but is, in the aftermath still in the mandate, not officially mandate, but still seen as mandate control. You have revolutions there, or you have nationalist movements in Egypt, right, with Nasser, or Mossadegh in Iran. So here we have another 1950s, 1960s period of what's called modernization. And however different those experiences were, right? However specific, Iraq, Iran, Egypt, very different, right? We might want to say that we can point out some patterns. And let me just list some patterns. One is the importance of the ruler, the leader, right? So Nasser in Egypt, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Mossadegh and then the Shah in Iran. We have, King Hussein of Jordan, right? So King Abdullah's father, the Hashemites. This sort of the leader is incredibly important. Secondly, there is the rhetoric of nationalism is also incredibly important in this period. Right? So the production of the feeling of loyalty to the nation state. We've talked about how internationalism, the sense of national belonging, is an incredibly new sentiment. And, if you have a new state, what's the difference between a Jordanian, the feeling of being a Jordanian, and feeling like a Syrian, or feeling like you're Lebanese? And how does that national feeling get produced? And you read a little bit about with the Andrew Shryock piece, nationalism and genealogy and the notion of the tribe and so on. So in this period, in the 50s and 60s, you have the importance of the ruler, the intense nationalist rhetoric is producing the sense of what it means to be Egyptian as opposed to Jordanian, as opposed to Lebanese, as opposed to Syrian, as opposed to Iraqi, as opposed to Iranian, and so on. And this rhetoric was often anti-imperialist, because these are post-colonial states that are shedding their imperial relationships, and they're establishing a national identity against Europe, but also against the other states, right? But there were periods in the 1950s where there was an attempt to create pan-Arab nationalist unions. So there was a moment where Egypt and Syria and Iraq were going to be politically unified. The United Arab Republic, it was called. The United Arab Republic. It was Iraq, Syria, and Egypt, right? Because it was an attempt to both try to create some kind of sense of nation, but then these nations also said, well, what's the difference between Egypt and Iraq? And these are borders that are made up from the Mandate period and colonial borders, and we're going to try to make some kind of pan-Arab nationalist sentiment. These experiments failed. Political parties, who was going to be more powerful, Saddam Hussein or Nasser, right? I mean, or the Assads in Syria, right? Yeah.
Is it almost similar to like the European Union right now, or?
Yeah, I mean that's what's so interesting. But the European Union has emphasized economic cooperation. And the moments that they have tried to create some sense of common European identity hasn't worked. So the introduction of a common currency worked, right? You have the euro, but it wasn't so smooth in that it's not like Italians, however unstable the lira was, there was a nationalist sentiment, like the lira was Italian, right? And so all of a sudden you're no longer going to have Italian images. And so they had to figure out how to work the nationalist identification. They're not trying to create as much a common European identity as trying to create economic cooperation. And they do that by, opening borders for Europeans across, but then they also create more borders for other people. And it's also different in that there's no common language. The idea of Arab nationalism was built on this notion that there was some common language, even if the dialects were so different. Like Egyptian Arabic as opposed to Jordanian Arabic as opposed to, these are national groupings, but if you imagine within those regional dialect differences. So similar in some sense, but also quite different. Is that, yeah? Okay. So, third commonality was a rhetoric of stability, right? That these states were going to be, in the post-colonial moment, establish a modern state that's stable. We're not going to have coups all the time. We're not going to have tribes coming in and disrupting the state, right? So the stability, a rhetoric of stability. But of course, the upside, the other side of stability is policing. So the rhetoric of stability, it's like, if we're going to have a stable state, we should have a stable state, then you may want to give up some of your individual liberties for the sake of the stability of the state. So there was a lot in this period of rhetoric of stability, on the one hand, language of stability, but the reality of the maintenance of that stability based on a very strong police, secret police, and civil police, public police efforts, and throughout the region. Okay, and this was part of these new states. And then finally, part of this too, there's a lot of emphasis on military in all of these states. So not only in terms of military performance, like parades, like military parades, but the idea of the military parade, is interesting, right? Because it's introducing what? What is a military parade doing? If you have a huge military parade down Fifth Avenue, what is the message of a military parade?
Just showcasing, I guess, your progress or your power.
Right? So showcase your power, but to whom? Who are you showcasing it to?
To people that are certain.
So on the one hand, you're showcasing your internal power to your own citizens, right? But that's not all, right. So on the one hand, you're saying, okay, look how much power we have over you as our, the centralized state has this power. But it's celebratory, right? It's not, we're not doing a military parade. It's not coming out and saying, look at how much centralized power I have. I'm going to beat you up and put you all in jail. It's a parade to be proud of, right? That's the whole point, that you are drawing in as citizens to participate and be proud of this power. So it's both an internal sense that this is our power, don't mess with us internally, but also external representation. So there's a lot of, in all of these, so these are some patterns. So I mentioned 5, and 3 of them, there's quite a bit of overlap. Rhetoric of stability, presence of police state, fear as part of that, and then military codes. Now, in addition, the final thing that the 6th point that I want to make that is pretty common has to do with economics. So these are sort of governing systems. Importance of the ruler, importance of the military and the police, and stability, right? Anti-imperialist nationalist rhetoric. And then finally is the sort of common thread, although not absolutely evenly and not exactly the same everywhere, but a centralized economy. Now, of course, there are pressures to be more centralized or at least more nationalized in, for example, Iran, right, where you had all these oil concessions. But this was very popular, right? To have a nationalized, centralized economy was popular because with it came an idea of more equal distribution. Right? So if you have a nationalized economic structure, a centralized economic structure, part of the effect of that, in terms of the ideas about it, is that it's going to produce more quality economics. Distribution will be fairer, right? As opposed to the sort of free market economic system, which will then create much more class differentiation, right? Yeah.
But didn't that consolidation also lead pretty directly to kleptocracies and people kind of consolidating wealth in the hands of the powerful just for their own benefit?
Yeah, it's not that there wasn't it's not that in practice there wasn't then corruption, right? And that's some of the undermining, like why so many people ultimately get really frustrated with it and say it's failed, right? So the idea that there would be a very small cohort of people in political power, so that centralization was so narrow and it created wealth for a very small group of people. And that's ultimately, people complain and say they undermine. And Oman is facing that now, right? A lot of centralization, but then who gets the contracts for the new tourist development on the waterfront is a cousin of the Sultan. I mean, it's just, whatever, that's, yes, so exactly. Ideally, that's not what's going to happen, but in practice, it often will. But in the 50s and 60s, Oman's a different case because the stuff comes so much later. It comes in the 70s and 80s. But in the rest of the Middle East, you see this in the 50s and 60s. Interest in centralizing, nationalizing the economy in the interest of more equal distribution. So, all right. So this is one sort of 50s, 60s modernization move. So, however, in the 60s and 70s, at the same time, a little later, the same time as these in the Middle East, there is this kind of process. And again, differently in different states, but we can see some patterns. In the United States, there is another set of discourses and debates which argues against what I just argued was going on in the Middle East. Of course, part of that had to do with Cold War politics, and we talked about, the CIA coup in Iran, but also, of course, Nasser was, a huge problem in the United States. But part of the idea, sort of the ideas underneath the questioning or the attacks on those centralized economic forms and political tools was not only the Cold War, or the Cold War on its own, a fear of communism writ large. There was a whole set of economic theories that went along with that fear. Right? So it wasn't just a blanket, we're afraid of communists, we're afraid of the Soviet Union, anything that seems similar to that we're going to undermine politically. There was an economic, a whole series of universities, research centers are producing literature, debates, arguments against that set of ideas. And that sort of the series of debates, arguments against that kind of centralization was itself, and that's why it sounds confusing, called modernization theory. That's just what it was called. The theories that ultimately were used to develop in a way that was against that kind of centralized model, both in terms of governing, right, and in terms of economics. So let me just introduce this idea. Has anyone heard of modernization theory? Talked about modernization theory in other classes? No? This theory was used as a kind of blueprint for thinking about how to modernize or develop societies all over the world. Whether it was in Latin America, whether it was in the Middle East, whether it was in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, right? So it was a model. And it was a way of thinking about what was wrong with the kind of modernity, the changes in the 50s and 60s in the Middle East, but there were also in other places, and other places that didn't have states and economic systems as they were even in the Middle East. Okay. This theory was sort of proposed by someone by the name of Walt Rostow. And in it, he proposed that all societies could or would or were in one of 5 stages of development. 5 stages of development. So all societies were in one or 5 stages of development. And modern society would emerge in that 5th stage. This theory, if you've taken sort of Anthro 101, sounds eerily similar to the unilinear evolutionary model of 19th century anthropologists. Remember, who argued, for many of you, the idea that all humans could go through one of 3 stages: savagery, barbarianism, or civilization. Does everyone remember this from Anthro 101, right? So in the 19th century, anthropologists had this idea, and to them, it was not racist, because the idea was that all humans were ultimately the same, and all could go through these one of these stages. Of course, later anthropologists said, well, that's completely ridiculous, all societies are different, and ultimately that model of civilization goes back to your comment that was Europe. And so we were all somehow ending up in Europe, right? So this model of Rostow's is very similar, okay? His model, his 5 stages, are traditionalism. They're kind of funny to say. Okay, traditionalism. Then he has something called precondition for takeoff. Like airplanes take off. Takeoff, that's the 3rd stage. Okay, so you've now taken off. Traditionalism. Precondition for takeoff. Takeoff. Then the 4th stage would be drive to maturity. So now you're becoming an adult, right? Drive, yeah. Drive to maturity. And you get to the ultimate, very wonderful end of the age of high mass consumption. And that's development. So now we can all buy our iPhones and iPads, and we're modern. Okay? Is everyone seeing what this? All right, so these are these stages, and Rostow proposed that all societies were in one of these stages, and you just had to get the society out of traditionalism onto that precondition for takeoff and encourage takeoff, and ultimately, is everyone following? Okay. Now, what are you thinking? You're somebody thinking.
Oh no, I just think it's silly. I don't know, not silly, but it's just, it's so odd.
Yeah.
It's just the names of everything in this.
Yeah, so the metaphor, the language is interesting. So what is, what are they thinking? Obviously you end up in mass consumption, that's the ideal. That somehow, yeah.
I was just thinking it's funny because like this was done in the 60s and 70s, like the mass consumption then, it was like way below what we consider now like.
Exactly. Exactly, but that was like the introduction of mass consumption, where televisions were being introduced in the 50s and then more in the early 60s to families all over, and advertising was exploding. Anyone see Mad Men? That's what Mad Men's about, is the production of mass consumption through advertising. Right? So, and that's the theory of the idea, right? The idea that you could own, that everyone could own all these things, was exactly this. And then America was modern. Because now everyone could have desire it and potentially own it. Yes.
Oh, was Walt Rostow, was he
Yes. Yes.
So when you talk about traditionalism, do we mean that the Europeans' traditionalism superior is modern and the other tradition is not? That,
no.
Do we try to say
He
that?
thought that traditionalism
Of all everything.
Europeans and Americans had gone beyond traditionalism. Traditionalism is what's holding development back. So what you have to do, the only question is, how do you get societies on this path? What is traditionalism? What are the things that are containing, controlling, limiting societies in that stage of traditionalism? For Rostow, there were two primary things. Capital to industrialize. So if you give societies as loans, for example, through the IMF or World Bank, capital to industrialize, that is one thing. So that would provide the material conditions for a modern society. But of course, that's not enough, right? You can't just simply give societies the material. That's not being modern enough. You have to do something else. And you have to change people's attitudes to get them out of traditionalism and get them down this path. And for Rostow, the second point, and probably even more important than capital to industrialize, was instilling the ideals of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship. For him, entrepreneurship was incredibly important. Why entrepreneurship? Yes.
Well, it leads to capitalism.
How?
Well, it's the base of the free market system as entrepreneurship. So,
How is entrepreneurship the basis of the free market system?
Instead of somebody telling you what to do, instead of being overly regulated, you get up and do what you want to do, and you create your own market so that other people see that you're doing that, so then they think, oh, well, let me hop on that bandwagon, and they create their market, and then there's competition.
And it's entrepreneurship on the individual level. So any ties, let's imagine we're in the same family. You want to go open your business, I'm going to go open my business. We're brother and sister. I'm going to gain wealth for me. You're going to gain wealth for you. I'm not going to start funneling money to you and help you, you know what I mean? So entrepreneurship is not only capitalism breaking, sort of encouraging competition sort of in abstract. It's encouraging competition on the basis of individuals. Right? So that someone in a family will do well, and they're going to do well for themselves. And the idea is, once people do well, like the idea of entrepreneurship is like, I'm going to do really well financially, economically, and I'm going to benefit personally. And I am responsible as an individual, supposedly, for that wealth. Is everyone following? Why like, entrepreneurship as an idea became so important for this development model, and what kinds of repercussions it has in terms of not only economics, but in terms of what an individual is, who an individual is, never mind what an individual's rights are, what they can expect, what they should expect. Does everyone? You're gonna say something else.
Oh no, it just leads to this American idea of individualism, and I could see it kind of breaking up any of the tribal ideas. It's kind of breaking all that up.
Exactly. So it breaks up loyalty based on kin, right? It breaks up loyalty based on kin. And for Rostow, loyalty based on kin is traditionalism. And that's what's holding back for him, and it became part of the ideal of like development work coming out of the United States. It became the ideal of social reform. So not only would you give money to capitalize industry, like big industry, you'd also give grants to encourage entrepreneurs, training entrepreneurs in colleges, introducing entrepreneur lectures in high school textbooks. Is everyone following? Nothing like this idea of brainwashing. That wasn't, I don't think it was, but it was like the idea of a value. That's what they believed. They believed that entrepreneurship was a modern value that was going to develop societies. And other kind of loyalties were keeping societies, quote unquote, backward. Yeah.
We saw the opposite in the Khazar when the Europeans came and do the Tobago and the Darcy agreement.
Yeah.
Iran was actually getting loaned by them.
Yeah.
Too much loan. The Khazar have to pay.
Right, well, but that becomes the underside of those loans, of those capital loans, right? The IMF saying, okay, instead, and then there are huge debates. Like, we're not gonna, after World War II, right? This is also, a couple decades after the Second World War, where the idea, coming out of, has anyone heard of Bretton-Woods? Bretton-Woods Agreement? Yes? No? So, in the aftermath of the Second World War, leaders come together and say, the reason why we had the Second World War was because Germany was collapsed economically. Germany completely collapsed, and as its banks were failing, the U.S. kept demanding its loans to be repaid, and there was no social support internally for the collapse of the German economy. So 2 reasons. But the reason for the Second World War was German economic collapse. So as a world community, what can we do to prevent that from happening again? And what we can do to prevent that from happening again, in the 1940s, the idea was that we need to ensure that states provide social nets for people, right? That if, the economy collapses, the government provides a net. So there's this, you don't just free fall for social services, for individuals, for people, right? But also, we need to provide a system where states help each other in the case of a potential economic collapse somewhere. right? So if a country looks like it's starting to spiral, and it cannot provide for that net, other countries put into a fund, and then other countries can borrow in order to prevent this kind of spiral again. Is everyone following? Yeah.
This type of thing now in modern day also cause a problem to countries like Bangladesh, for my country. The political leaders, they take the money and they use it for themselves, and later on they tax the common people a lot of money and the toll money, and that's create problem actually in the other hand.
Okay. So you're talking about what's called structural adjustment. It has a very formal name. We call it corruption, but there's actually a formal name called structural adjustment. And so what happens, and this we're sort of getting off tangent a little bit, but you're talking about the experience of these loans. So in other words, so on one hand, the idea was to prevent states from spiraling out of control. But the other part of it was, by the 1950s and 60s, that idea of loans was also transformed into this idea of modernization and industrialization. So industry was modern, right, as Mariam said. That's modernity, if you industrialize. But countries don't have the capital to industrialize, so you take money out of this fund, the IMF and the World Bank, and you give countries loans. You don't just hand it out, but you give them a loan. Okay. You did have different issues. Some countries, there are claims that that money is being funneled to a very few elite, and then that money disappears and it cannot be paid back. Or other less corrupt systems, let's say, that money is put into industry and the industry fails. Now, how are those loans supposed to be paid back? So the UN meets, and this is what the idea of, saying, okay, let's just create a blank slate for those loans. So every year, there's a whole debate about what to do about these loans. And often, it's much easier to say, okay, let's just start from zero, because a country cannot pay those back. Another way of handling it is not to say, we're not going to start from zero, because then people will say, well, if we start from zero, then the countries will learn, they borrow, and they never pay back, and you get into this cycle. So the other way to handle it is what's called structural adjustment, which means the country is made to pay back the loans, but it's the IMF and the World Bank that come in and readjust the economy of the country. And in readjusting the economy of the country, what happens often is that subsidies, like those countries have borrowed and create a social network, and do that by having subsidies for basic foodstuffs, like bread. I mean, I don't know if Bangladesh is this similar.
Yeah.
Bread.
Can I share some experiences, real event? In India, you heard of a revolution by Anna Hazare. It's like a new party, they came out of corruption. So interview was taken 6 years ago, and there's a guy named Lalu. His profession is to take care of the cattle, and in a whole life, his most income probably would be 1 million. That would be his income. But if they found out from Swiss bank that he had $500 million in his bank, so they asked him where this money came from. Then he said, "I'm not obliged to answer you," and that created a huge revolution in India. Now.
Okay. So let's just go back to the structural adjustment. The say that okay, we're not going to ignore your, what's the technical term, I can't remember, your loans. Another way of handling it is to say, okay, we're going to come in and restructure your economy, or you must restructure your economy, and basically impose what are called austerity measures. Right? We went through austerity, supposedly, 2 years ago. Right? Why, there are no, they just stop. Things shut down. Right? Money stops flowing in. We're under austerity. Therefore, certain things get put into place. And by austerity measures is what, the structural adjustment system, where subsidies are stopped because that means the state is just throwing away money. Taxes are increased to try to repay these loans. Okay. So that's one of the effects that we can see. All right. But going back to Rostow's, so this is out of Bretton-Woods. So Rostow's idea had to do more with taking some of that Bretton-Woods, the ideas out of Bretton-Woods that had to do with creating safety nets and encouraging industry, right? So he took that and he thought about that in terms of, again, more capital to industrialize, but also in terms of this entrepreneurship notion, right? That you're going to encourage the sense of entrepreneurship and therefore create modern citizens, modern capitalist citizens. That's the idea, right? Okay. Now, of course, there have been lots of critiques of this modernization theory, not simply because of the things you say, right? Like, where is this, you know, what are these, what does it take off? Never mind like the critique of it being Eurocentric, all of that. But besides those critiques, the other most tangible critique is that despite all this, there is actually more poverty in the world today than there was before. So instead of getting rid of poverty, this modernization theory, this sort of impulse to modernize on this model, is basically a trickle-down model, right? You industrialize, and therefore the rest of the society will somehow, but then you encourage these notions of entrepreneurship that's going to go along with this industrialization, right? So it's a kind of trickle-down model. So in that, the critique is, well, it's actually failed in terms of poverty globally. Yes, you may have a lot of industry in China, in Bangladesh, right? So you have a huge garment industry in Bangladesh, but does that mean people are less poor? No, right? So there's clearly something that's not working, something's wrong with the theory. And that goes back to what Patrick said, is that, you introduce industry, it's not going to create equality and alleviate poverty. Now, just on a side, before I go into the kinds of critiques, one of the major critiques of this, and to give you a language for that critique, part of the other side of this, the idea of traditionalism that Rostow was working with, that not only had to do with entrepreneurship, but one of the things that sort of was piggybacked onto this was an idea that along with modernization, in this model, the Rostow model, along with modernization, what you're going to see is secularization. The modernization in this way, entrepreneurship, industry, people will stop being so traditional, quote unquote, and will also become more secular. Of course, what's so interesting is that in the Middle East in the 50s and 60s, the states were already incredibly secular. Is everyone following? So just like what exactly that meant, right? So we're talking about Nasser, we're talking about the Shah, we're talking about in Jordan, we're talking about states that Algeria, which is a nationalist, often socialist, centralized economies that were incredibly secular. But in terms of this model, this idea that modern life, if you're modern, then you're not religious. Is everyone following? That's what's so interesting. I thought someone was going to say that here. But no one did, right? And I think that's because what we recognize is that it's not so much that people become less religious, it's that and this is one of the arguments that I've made, is that religion changes. Like what constitutes religion? Yeah.
But another side of that is that when things get tough, it's the first thing that people go to also.
Awesome.
Is that when, like your money or you're in poverty or the program you were put on doesn't work for you, a lot of people turn to religion for like,
comfort.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so there's that. But also, so that, if you feel like you haven't been part of a religious community and want a community because everyone else is an individual, right? You're in a world of individuals, and religion provides a community, because we don't have community any other way, then it's a clear place to go to have community. So there's that, but there's also the situation where, you know, with modernization, again, rather than religion disappearing, being religious is a different kind of experience, right? So religion is no longer, and this is what I was trying to say last time, religion is no longer just something that you are because you are human and good, right? So being a sort of sense of morality, that you're a good person, and that's associated in certain contexts, not all contexts, right? I'm not saying that you have to be religious to be good. I'm not saying that, right? Right? You can be a moral, secular, atheist, you know, it has nothing to do with that. But the notion of religion, right? That religion is a thing to be in, can be just, you know, not defined, non-defined. Just you are a good person, you are good to your neighbors, you're good to your family, you're good to other people, and that can be understood as something called religion, too. Now, what we've seen, you know, is that with industrialization, with entrepreneurship, with all of these dramatic changes in economy and society, people are not less religious, but they're differently religious. So religion has become a thing. It's become what we say, and this is what Hart was trying to talk about, become objectified. Because it becomes like an object. It's not just an experience as part of being a human being. It's something that you define and have to be appropriately right with certain regulations and laws and so forth. So just to keep that in mind, because it pertains so much to the contemporary ways. All right, the critique of this modernization theory came from someone by the name, well, there's a whole series of people, but the person who most is Frank. Andre Boucher. And he argued that inequality, poverty, quote-unquote underdevelopment around the world is not caused by the wrong values, i.e. not being entrepreneurial enough. Right? That's not the problem. Nor is the problem capital for industrialization. That isn't the problem. That doesn't in itself cause underdevelopment. What he said was causing underdevelopment was the fact that certain states were exploiting other states. In other words, you have, and he created what's called, he called this dependency theory. So he wasn't really thinking, you know, he wasn't introducing necessarily a theory of global modernization, right? What he was doing was critiquing this modernization theory and saying this modernization theory is wrong because, quote unquote, underdevelopment, inequality, poverty around the world isn't caused by, again, the wrong values, tribal, religious, you know, non-individual enough. Basically, the idea is that people around the world were not individualistic enough. If they were individualistic, like Americans, then everyone would be modern, like Americans, right? If they had the right values. And he's saying that's not the problem. The reason why there's underdevelopment and poverty and so on is because basically a legacy of colonial relationships where some states have, are producers of goods, and other states are the producers of raw materials. Now we're in a different economic phase, but we're talking about the 60s, 70s, where manufacturing is in what he called the core countries, right? United States, England, manufacturing, and raw materials are coming from different countries in Africa, coming from South Asia, and those raw materials are getting exploited by the core countries. So he divided into what he called core, periphery, semi-periphery, and periphery. He said, if you look at the globe, different countries fall into one of these types of places and as such, enter a world economic capitalist system. So there is now, there are different periodizations of this world economic system, but the idea is that with colonialism, we began this world economic system, a global economic system, where different countries are part of this world system in different ways. Some of the countries are in it as core countries that are core countries of manufacturing and wealth. The other countries are either peripheral to the system or semi-peripheral and produce raw materials for that core. And it creates a system of dependency. And dependency, of course, works in two ways, right? The core countries need the raw material, so they're dependent. But then it's a matter of creating those other, those semi-peripheral and peripheral countries are even more dependent on the core countries. Because the core countries can move, search for raw materials anywhere, right? I'm not getting enough cotton, let's say from here, I'll go somewhere else to get it. But those countries that become dependent on selling the cotton don't have as many choices, right? So it creates a system of what he called dependency theory, and that is what's causing, so it's capitalism itself, going back to what you're saying, capitalism itself that produces this poverty and inequality rather than rectifying. Yes, go, you're next, sorry.
And that's also based on the dehumanization factor of it, where the periphery countries that produce the raw material only produce the raw material and only see a small portion of it, so they process cotton, send the cotton to another country gives it back bed sheets.
Exactly. So they're alienated, in other words, from the means and modes of production. So it's a theory that's critical of this capitalist model, basically. And it introduces exactly what you were saying, Heidi, too, that the idea that there are within these various peripheral and semi-peripheral countries, not necessarily even in the core countries, but in the semi-peripheral and peripheral countries, an elite class of what are called compromisers, who like this happening because it benefits them. So there's an elite, so it's not just, and they want to do this because they see benefits of being the plantation owners of the cotton fields. Is everyone following, or the tobacco fields, or whatever other tea plantation in Sri Lanka, or whatever? Is everyone seeing what this whole debate is? Okay. It basically, in other words, forces specialization in production of raw materials, so cash crops. And it's the cash crop economy that has, according to Frank, produced this underdevelopment itself. It's not a question of values, and it's a legacy of the colonial world. It's basically what he called, not he called it, other people have called world system the capitalist world. That all countries are part of this. You can't, it's really impossible to step out of it, and all the countries become dependent on each other. For frank and sort of more radical theorists of this ilk, the only way to get out of it would be a revolution, basically, and to remove, right? Remove the compromisers that elite has. It's called the comprador. The comprador. So the idea, in other words, this is, it's a clearly very Marxist model, okay? And it argues that it attends to the fact that it's not just, colonial power that just transforms a society, but a society itself has its class structures that are reproduced and encouraged through the system because you have this elite compradorial class that is, working against its own society. So it creates class structures, which is exactly what, yeah.
It reminds me of Jacobin's removal of bourgeoisie class.
Yes, exactly. It would be a Jacobin revolutionary getting rid of the bourgeois. But here the bourgeois are very small. The compradors are not necessarily a large class, unlike the bourgeoisie was imagined as a much bigger class. Yes.
The other side of that too is, once you have an innovation like the wheel, you can't ever go back to a life without the wheel.
Right.
And so, even with removal of the Jacobins and the bourgeois, they become the bourgeois themselves. They step into that class and take up the role. So then there's another revolution behind them. So there is no there's no escaping the cycle once you're in it.
Taking over the cities because there was corruption in the cities. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. But the theory would be in practice that wouldn't happen, right? And in fact, if you read, for example, the Communist Manifesto, then the Communist Manifesto is so interesting. So much of the Communist Manifesto is about the bourgeoisie. It's not about the aristocracy. The aristocracy is not, they're done. This is the 19th century. Right? Aristocracy is done in the 18th century, supposedly. Now the problem is the bourgeoisie.
I read a portion of Das Kapital written by Karl Marx.
Yeah.
So they have similarity.
Right. So the manifesto is incredibly clear with that. So this is what these ideas about modernization and the debates about modernization in the 1960s and into the 70s, right? It was about, free market, capitalism, and a kind of Marxist, leftist critique of that in terms of development, modernization, economic. Now we're sort of beyond these two sort of polarized views of what modernization, modernity is, but these two formed so much of theories about development in the Middle East. Right? This is what people in power in the Middle East were doing, as well as non-government organizations and development agencies going to try to help these countries quote unquote develop. Now, these are the sort of economic textbooks to think about how do you develop a society, how do you modernize, how do you best create the social relations. And now the interesting part that's missing in this, what do you think? What are some of the interesting parts that are missing in this debate?
Actual efficiency of practice.
Right. So the question about actual efficiency of practice, how would any of this be implemented on either scale, right? So whether it's the reintroduction of an expansive economy that's probably nationalized to some extent, but also not based on cash crops, right? On a riverfront model, with a revolutionary class taking over the state from the compradors, or the entrepreneurial, industrial. In neither of these models or discussions do we see a question about stability, the police, and militarization, the role of the ruler. This isn't the question of democracy, political representation. It's not really here. Yeah.
Is that because it was assumed that the economic system itself would be the ruler? That it would drive the state and drive the function of the government for the function of the government?
Right. Well, in the sense that in the entrepreneurial model, as in the model of the US, the entrepreneurs would demand, or if you're all budding, you grow up, you start learning to be entrepreneurs, if not in preschool, in pre-K, like go out and do your individual little blocks on your own, you know, yay, you did that block so well by yourself, no help from anyone else, right? From that entrepreneurial sphere, go and get the, you know, Play-Doh on your own, no one's gonna help you, just go do it. From that spirit, right, whether you will then demand a say individually, as an individual who demands rights and representation in government. So in that sense, the idea was liberalism, right, as you were saying, right, social rights, equality would emerge out of that entrepreneurial spirit. Yeah, to some extent, though it sort of seemed to not be what anyone was really concerned about.
Because I was thinking with Walt Rostow specifically, it was like a very Ayn Rand aspect of pure capitalism. And capitalism as like a government is only a hindrance to the pure function of human form. And human form is capitalistic expansion.
Exactly. So it's a very almost what we call neoliberal model, where individuals will be the best producers of a general economy and also be the best and correct expressors of individual desire and rights and consumption. And that, the idea is consumption. Have access to that consumer. So, but what's interesting is in this debate, it seems that the idea of the police state, the presence of the military, questions of democracy, representation, are sort of seen as less significant as the introduction to certain kind of economic reforms. And then the idea that those will come later. Once you're modern enough, then you can also be democratic. We will continue this on Thursday and looking at some different kinds of pieces of development.